In just 3 years, from 1943 to 1946, a trio of titans, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, reshaped the post-war world. Their alliance, born of necessity, concealed simmering tensions, since each man aimed to impose his own vision of the global order. Through the Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam conferences, they redrew borders, upended nations, and unwittingly planted the seeds of a new, deadly rivalry that would grip the world for decades. Dark words from Winston Churchill about an Iron Curtain soon echoed across the globe, revealing how one conflict's end fueled another's beginning. In that brief historical window, entire regions were recast, laying the groundwork for an ideological clash poised to eclipse all past wars. How did these leaders, each with distinct plans, manage to shape a worldwide map for lasting peace? What drove them, and at what cost? And where did they fail? By late 1943, the Allies had scored significant victories, yet still faced the Nazi war machine at its fiercest. In North Africa, Axis forces surrendered in May, clearing the way for the invasion of Sicily that July. With the island secured by mid-August, Allied troops landed in mainland Italy that September. Although Mussolini had been disposed and jailed, Germany held firm in southern and central Italy, maintaining a strong line along the Winter Line, including the Gustav Line near Monte Cassino, far from the Gothic Line, which would come into play in 1944. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army seized momentum after its triumph at Stalingrad and began retaking territory. That summer, Soviet forces repelled Germany's last major offensive at Kursk and pushed onward through Ukraine, dealing severe blows to the Wehrmacht. In this setting, Allied leaders chose Tehran in Iran for their first face-to-face meeting because it lay close to Soviet territory and, although loosely under Allied control, still provided relative security. Churchill, charismatic and combative, arrived with crates of cigars and whiskey, while President Roosevelt, though physically waning, strove to appear strong and upbeat. Stalin watched his counterparts with cool calculation, fully aware of his leverage thanks to Soviet gains on the Eastern Front. He strongly pressed for the immediate opening of a second front in Western Europe.
Did you know that most people who watch our documentaries aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy animated maps and history, join our community. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next episodes.
The Tehran Conference marked a turning point in Allied collaboration. The Big Three convened face-to-face to orchestrate a global strategy aimed at crushing Nazi Germany. At the heart of their plans lay Operation Overlord, the long-anticipated invasion of France, slated for mid-1944. In return, Stalin pledged to launch a major offensive in the east, coordinating with the Western Allies to keep German forces split between two fronts. Military matters were not the only concern. The Allies agreed to support Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, reaffirmed Iran's post-war sovereignty, and weighed Turkey's potential entry against the Axis. They also floated ideas for occupying or carving up Germany to prevent a future resurgence. One of the most contentious issues was Poland's borders. Stalin demanded the Curzon Line in the east, formally annexing territories the USSR had seized in 1939, and proposed compensating Poland with German lands, stretching to what would become the Oder-Neisse Line. Roosevelt and Churchill did not formally endorse this shift, but refrained from rejecting it, setting the stage for drastic changes in Central Europe. Yet the fragility of Allied unity emerged during a private dinner after the second plenary session. Stalin suggested executing 50,000 German officers to prevent the reformation of a potent German army. Horrified, Churchill declared Britain would never condone such slaughter. He would sooner face a firing squad himself. A misplaced joke from Roosevelt, compounded by his son Elliot's agreement, infuriated Churchill, who stormed out in outrage. Though united by a common foe, Tehran revealed profound, near irreconcilable rifts over how to remake Europe once victory drew near. By early 1945, Nazi Germany appeared on the verge of collapse. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin gathered at Yalta, on Crimea's southern coast, in the Levadia Palace, once the summer home of Tsar Nicholas II. Though palm trees and sea breezes surrounded them, the decisions made here would shape Europe for decades. Their immediate focus was Germany. The Allies agreed on 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, with Berlin likewise divided. Demilitarization and denazification were mandatory policies. War reparations proved contentious. They formed a new commission to decide how much Germany would pay, especially to the war-ravaged Soviet Union. Another core topic was establishing the United Nations, designed to prevent future global conflicts. Building on earlier ideas, the leaders solidified a Security Council with 5 permanent members, each wielding veto power, a system with far-reaching consequences. Lauded as an Allied triumph, Yalta nevertheless revealed each leader's unique post-war vision. Beneath polite exteriors, the seeds of conflict had already taken root. No issue at Yalta proved more divisive than Poland. Stalin, as at Tehran, insisted on recognizing the Curzon Line as the eastern boundary, legitimizing Soviet authority over lands seized in 1939. In exchange, Poland would absorb parts of eastern Germany, shifting its border to the Oder-Neisse line. Churchill and Roosevelt, reluctant to provoke Stalin, consented as long as free elections took place in Poland and elsewhere, an assurance swiftly undermined by the rise of pro-communist regimes across Eastern Europe. The Declaration on Liberated Europe aimed to guarantee self-determination, but its vagueness granted Stalin wide latitude. Meanwhile, plans to try Nazi war criminals gained momentum, foreshadowing the Nuremberg trials. In a secret protocol, Stalin promised to declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In return, he obtained southern Sakhalin, the Kurils, and influence in Manchuria, redefining Asia's map. Though Yalta outwardly signaled Allied cooperation, distrust deepened. Churchill feared Soviet expansionism, Roosevelt's health was waning, and Stalin, emboldened by the Red Army's momentum, felt unstoppable. These precarious agreements lit the fuse for an East-West rift even before the World War ended. Barely 2 months after Yalta, the world was shaken by President Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, a quiet locale in the American Southeast. Having led the nation through the Great Depression and nearly all of World War II, FDR had become an iconic figure at home and abroad. With his passing, Vice President Harry S. Truman, less seasoned in high-stakes diplomacy, assumed the role of commander-in-chief. His tougher stance toward Stalin significantly influenced the upcoming Potsdam Conference and the post-war landscape. In July 1945, after Nazi Germany's surrender, Winston Churchill suffered a dramatic electoral defeat to Clement Attlee. Churchill did attend the start of the Potsdam Conference, which opened on July 17, but he was compelled to return to London on July 26, when the election results confirmed a Labour victory. In his place, Attlee took over negotiations for the second phase of the meeting. Only Joseph Stalin remained from the original Big Three of Tehran and Yalta, now joined by Harry S. Truman and Attlee in Potsdam, near Berlin, within the Soviet occupation zone. Here, they formally confirmed Germany's division into 4 sectors, as well as Berlin's partition under the Allied Control Council. Fierce debates erupted over reparations. The USSR demanded heavy compensation from Eastern Germany, while the Western Allies, mindful of Versailles, urged restraint. Deciding Poland's western boundary was crucial. By provisionally approving the Oder-Neisse line, Silesia, Pomerania, and large parts of East Prussia passed to Poland, forcing millions of Germans from their homes. Königsberg, later Kaliningrad, went to the USSR, redrawing Central Europe. The Foreign Ministers' Council was formed to prepare peace treaties with Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Finland, and to devise a final plan for Germany. Austria remained occupied and administered separately. During Potsdam, Truman received news of the stunning success of the atomic bomb test at Los Alamos, stifling his resolve. The conference concluded with the Potsdam Declaration, delivering Japan an ultimatum of conditional surrender or prompt and utter destruction. After Potsdam, Central and Eastern Europe underwent sweeping transformations. Under Allied administration, Germany would split into West Germany, American, British, and French zones, and East Germany, Soviet zone. Berlin, lying deep in Soviet-held territory, remained divided, its western sectors an island inside East Germany. Having surrendered its eastern lands to the USSR, Poland gained Silesia, Pomerania, and parts of East Prussia under the Odense deal, expelling millions of Germans. Farther north, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania stayed under Soviet rule. As the Foreign Ministers' Council negotiated with the Axis's former partners, Austria, though previously annexed, remained occupied separately, awaiting restored independence. Simultaneously, the Allies advanced war crimes proceedings, culminating at Nuremberg. In mere months, borders shifted, populations were displaced, and Europe's structure was recast. These upheavals paved the way for decades of East-West rivalry. While Europe was carved into occupation zones, Asia, too, faced sweeping post-war realignments. The Soviet Union annexed southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands from Japan, fulfilling Yalta's terms. Korea was split along the 38th parallel, entrenching a permanent rift between a Soviet-backed north and a US-supported south. In China, Soviet troops withdrew from Manchuria, leaving a vacuum that reignited civil war. Meanwhile, European efforts to reclaim Indochina and the Dutch East Indies sparked fierce independence movements. These redrawings sowed the seeds of future conflicts, from the Korean War to anti-colonial revolutions. Within a year of Potsdam, on March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill visited Fulton, Missouri, and delivered a speech that shattered any illusions of Allied unity. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, he declared. This dramatic proclamation publicly affirmed the rift between the Western democracies and the Soviet-dominated East. Churchill's words reverberated worldwide. By defining the Soviet bloc as a cordoned-off realm, he effectively codified the East-West divide. Although tensions had been simmering over Poland, occupation zones, and the absence of free elections in the East, this moment made the fault line undeniable. The era of Allied cooperation ended, yielding a bipolar world soon governed by nuclear arsenals and ideological battles. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech exposed just how fragile that peace really was. Summer 1948. Every 90 seconds, a plane touched down in West Berlin. Over 1,400 flights in a single day, more than 700 aircraft involved, and 20,000 people committed to an unprecedented logistical feat. With Soviet forces blocking all routes to the city, over 2 million civilians were left isolated, surrounded by the blockade. How did they survive a total shutdown? And how was one of history's greatest relief operations ever organized? In the aftermath of 1945, Germany lay in ruins, carved up among the four victorious powers. Even Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was likewise split into four sectors. With cities leveled, factories in rubble, and hunger rampant, millions faced an uncertain future. With Europe's cities gutted and markets in disarray, the entire continent teetered on collapse. In the West, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, investing around $13 billion, worth over $150 billion today, to revive the shattered economies of Western Europe. Convinced that free markets were essential for stability, American and Western European leaders focused on rebuilding infrastructure and restoring trade. In West Germany, these funds jump-started reconstruction in the Ruhr and other industrial regions, spurring the repair of roads, warehouses, and vital services. The goal was clear: create a strong, self-sufficient market economy able to withstand new crises. Beyond the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union practiced a planned economy, strict state control, fixed quotas, and rapid heavy industry development. To Stalin, Western aid was a means to fortify capitalism on the doorstep of Eastern Europe, undermining socialism and Soviet security. The clash between market and state planning made post-war Germany a flashpoint of ideological tension. For Stalin, economic growth in the West directly threatened the socialist bloc. For Washington, meanwhile, European prosperity was both a moral duty and a strategic bulwark against communism. Thus emerged a tense East-West rivalry whose focal point would be Berlin. The United States, Britain, and France, bolstered by Marshall Plan aid, introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, designed to jumpstart the economy and replace the Reichsmark, which runaway inflation had rendered nearly worthless. In Frankfurt, the Bank Deutscher Länder swiftly began printing and distributing these new banknotes, laying the groundwork for the city's future global financial prominence. But when the Deutschmark also reached West Berlin, Soviet leaders in Moscow watched it spread with growing alarm. From their perspective, a capitalist and prosperous Germany, ever closer to Western powers, threatened Soviet authority in the region. Determined to halt this westward drift, the Soviets condemned the new currency as a breach of wartime accords. According to the Kremlin, the Allies were effectively forging a unified, capitalist West Germany, utterly at odds with Stalin's plan for a socialist buffer state. To prevent West Berlin from becoming a visible sign of Western prosperity in the heart of the Soviet zone, Moscow tightened its grip. It was the start of one of the earliest and most emblematic crises of the Cold War. In June 1948, the Soviet Union abruptly cut all rail, road, and water routes to West Berlin, effectively isolating the city from the Allied-controlled zones. Among the severed connections was the Helmstedt-Marienborn corridor, vital for supplies. Even on the Elbe River, new checkpoints paralyzed navigation and blocked coal shipments. Simultaneously, the Soviets sharply reduced electricity flow, worsening an already dire situation. Their intent was clear: deny more than 2 million Berliners every resource, hoping that Britain, France, and the United States would be forced to abandon West Berlin, which Moscow viewed as part of its own sphere of influence. For the population, this was a desperate time. With roads sealed and no way to bring in essential goods, many braced for a winter of hunger and despair. Some Berliners attempted makeshift solutions, yet supplies dwindled rapidly, fueling mounting fear and uncertainty. Allies recognized that quitting West Berlin would signal defeat and embolden further Soviet ambitions. Soviet authorities believed the Allies would never risk a direct confrontation and would simply withdraw. Yet in the West, various options were considered. At one point, leaders even weighed breaking the blockade by land, using military convoys along the Helmstedt-Marienborn corridor, the only highway connecting West Germany to Berlin. Diplomacy was also explored as a safer path, though it would have required significant political compromises. Ultimately, the boldest solution prevailed, supplying Berlin entirely by air, using flight rights that still applied from World War II. From a logistical standpoint, it seemed nearly impossible, but it had one decisive advantage: it avoided a direct military clash. Defying every prediction, Allied resolve won out. They chose not to abandon Berlin, launching what would become history's most ambitious airlift, an unparalleled operation still remembered today as one of the most emblematic episodes of the early Cold War. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet blockade sealed off more than 2 million Berliners. Just 2 days later, on June 26, the airlift officially began. At first, Allied C-47s carried around 2,000 tons a day, far too little to supply even 1,800 daily calories per person. Fuel shortages set in, the cold became pressing, and blackouts were frequent. Yet soon, the Allies introduced larger aircraft. The Americans used the C-54, while the British deployed the Arvo York and the Handley Page Hastings. Flight volume steadily increased, delivering not only food and medical supplies, but also the coal needed for heating and public utilities. As the effort grew, Operation Vittles became a tangible symbol of Western resolve. Berlin would not be abandoned. From the very start of Operation Vittles, or Operation Plainfare, as the British called it, military planners estimated that each Berliner required at least 1,800 to 2,000 calories a day, plus coal for heating and power generation. Their initial target was ambitious: 3,500 tons a day. Yet in the coldest months, that figure proved insufficient, ramping up logistical pressure. Even small outposts like Marker played a surprisingly big part. Though barely passable, certain back roads channeled Marshall Plan resources to local depots, which then trucked supplies to main bases. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, people grappled with strict rationing and continuous blackouts. Many spent the winter without heat, subsisting on fewer than 1,800 calories a day and living in constant fear of running out of essentials. Despite these daunting hardships, hopes remained alive that a resolute airlift would keep Berlin's spirit unbroken. In the initial weeks, chaos prevailed. The 3 Allied air corridors, each about 20 miles wide, were not yet managed in sync, and Tempelhof's landing schedules frequently overlapped. Officially, 2 corridors, northern and central, handled inbound flights from northern and central West Germany, while the southern one, from Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, handled flights exiting Berlin. In mid-July 1948, an event occurred that would become one of the operation's most beloved symbols. Lieutenant Gale Halvorsen, after a supply flight, gave a few chocolate bars to a group of children behind Tempelhof's fence. Moved by their delight, he began dropping candy with small cloth parachutes, creating the candy bombers. Though just a tiny part of the colossal logistics operation, that gesture brought real hope to the people, especially the youngest. Spurred by Halvorsen's example, more pilots joined in, lifting morale even citywide. General Lucius D. Clay, aware that the current system could never supply Berlin's needs, turned the operation over to William H. Tunner, a logistics expert renowned for running the perilous Hump airlift over the Himalayas in World War II. Tunner took command on July 28, 1948, intent on boosting transport to unheard-of levels. He restructured the 3 flight corridors, 2 inbound and 1 outbound, and introduced staggered altitudes to prevent collisions and allow landings every 3 minutes, day and night. Planes bound for Berlin entered the northern or central corridor at scheduled times and altitudes, choosing their route based on cargo. If the runway was in use, pilots flew a transition level before landing at Tempelhof, Gatow, or the new Tegel airfield, built at breakneck speed in November 1948. Crews unloaded in 20 to 30 minutes, then departed via the southern corridor. This precise rotation allowed multiple aircraft to fly without snarls. Under Tunner's direction, West German bases, Rhine-Main near Frankfurt, and Wiesbaden sped up loading. The British operated from Vosburg, Wunsdorf, and Celle, transporting coal, while in Berlin's British sector, Short Sunderland and Short Height seaplanes brought in salt without corroding cargo holds. The RAF expanded Gatow, and in the French sector, Tegel opened, reducing bottlenecks. By August 1948, daily tonnage surpassed 3,500, ensuring vital supplies despite blackouts and long lines. The candy bombers reminded everyone that relief truly came from the sky. Once logistics solidified, capacity rose sharply. By autumn, C-54 Skymasters replaced many Dakotas, raising totals above 5,000 tons a day. Soon, they exceeded 8,000, finally peaking at 12,941 tons on April 16, 1949, the famous Easter Parade. At that point, Berlin could rely on an emergency reserve. Tunner's reforms, grounded in innovation, transformed aerial logistics. Crews mastered schedules, ground teams ran shifts, and controllers guided wave after wave of incoming flights. Efficiency soared, underscoring the Allies' unwavering commitment to save the city. After almost a year of non-stop flights, the airlift proved an effective answer to Soviet pressure. On May 12, 1949, Stalin was forced to reopen land routes, yet the Allies kept flying until late September to bolster supplies. Altogether, around 277,000 flights were made, delivering over 2 million tons of aid. The operation's success turned Berlin into a symbol of Western resolve. Soon afterward, West Germany became the Federal Republic, with Bonn as its capital, while East Germany formed as the Democratic Republic, centered in East Berlin. Over the next 4 decades, West Berlin's airspace remained under tight Western Allied control, following the 1945 four-power agreements that granted only the United States, the United Kingdom, and France the right to operate military and civilian flights to and from West Berlin. Other airlines, including German carriers like Lufthansa, were barred until reunification. Only after the wall fell on October 28, 1990, could Lufthansa run its first official Berlin flight, symbolically ending an era when air corridors stood as a Cold War frontier. This milestone affirmed reunification and closed a chapter of aerial access.
Just 5 years after the nuclear devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world faced a new nightmare. For the first time since World War II, a fresh conflict erupted. This one fully fought during the Cold War. In Korea, a single people, united for centuries, was torn apart. 21 nations became involved, an alliance mosaic that forever altered the peninsula. 3 years of ferocious combat, over 2 million troops deployed, and more than 3 million casualties, both soldiers and civilians, nearly 10% of the Korean population at the time. Could the planet truly endure another cataclysm so soon? How could this happen? What interests and politics lay behind the international intervention? And why, more than 70 years later, has that war never truly ended, still shaping our world today? Under the Joseon dynasty, from 1392 to 1897, Korea experienced centuries of unified and relatively stable rule. Spanning roughly 220,000 square kilometers with a late 19th century population nearing 13 million, the peninsula stretched between the Yellow Sea to the west and the Sea of Japan to the east. Its capital, Hanseong, today Seoul, was strategically placed in the northwestern part of the peninsula. In 1897, after internal reform attempts and outside pressures, Korea proclaimed itself the Korean Empire, seeking to modernize its political structures. Yet the peninsula soon became a focal point in geopolitical rivalry among China, Russia, and Japan. Japan's victory in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War led to a protectorate over Korean territory, imposing strict limits on local sovereignty. In 1910, with Japan's formal annexation, a lengthy colonial era began, one that would reshape all of Korea. The country lost its autonomy and entered a new chapter under foreign dominance, forever altering its historical trajectory, a transformation felt across every province. Following the 1910 annexation, Japan imposed a harsh colonial regime in Korea that lasted until 1945. Public use of the Korean language was banned, while land and resources were seized to exploit the region's agricultural and mineral wealth. This policy widened the gap between the north, where factories and hydropower plants were built, and the south, which remained predominantly agrarian and lacked a solid industrial base. A key moment of resistance was the March 1st movement, Semeo-undong, in 1919, a mass protest demanding Korean independence. Though violently suppressed, nationalist sentiment grew stronger, driving many to exile or underground struggle. Meanwhile, Japanese occupation intensified. During World War II, over 200,000 Koreans were conscripted into Japan's military, and it is estimated that more than 200,000 Korean women were forced into sexual slavery in so-called comfort stations. In the north, certain communist activities received military and strategic support in Manchuria, among them Kim Il-sung, who, with Chinese training, several hundred fighters in total, possibly over 1,000 at various stages, and Soviet aid, formed well-organized guerrilla units capable of striking across the border. His rising stature drew new recruits and resources, setting the stage for future leadership. Elsewhere, both secular and Christian nationalists operated, creating a mosaic of resistance groups that, however fragmented, kept alive the spirit of independence. By the late 1930s, Korea's population exceeded 20 million, mostly engaged in agriculture, weakened by Japanese requisitions. As Allied forces advanced in Asia, aerial bombings hit strategic northern cities such as Hamhung and Wonsan, damaging the industrial infrastructure Tokyo had established on Korean soil. In August 1945, Japan's surrender ended 35 years of formal occupation in Korea, yet genuine autonomy did not immediately follow. At the United States' proposal, accepted by the Soviet Union, the line separating their respective spheres of influence was drawn along the 38th parallel. To the north, the Red Army entered mainly from the Andong area, now Dandong, in China, and from the region near the Tumen River, basing Soviet operations in Pyongyang. To the south, American forces landed at Incheon and Busan, taking military and administrative control, with Seoul as their principal hub. This occupation was meant to be temporary, guiding Korea toward a single government, but stark disagreements between Washington and Moscow soon made any joint administration unworkable. The North, home to around 9 million people at that time, hosted most of the heavy industries, such as chemical factories, steel mills, and coal mines. Intense land reform and nationalization policies were introduced under Soviet oversight, fueling local communist leaders' popularity. Among them was Kim Il-sung, already noted for his guerrilla activities in Manchuria, who gradually tightened his hold on the region's political and economic apparatus. Rural communities in the north benefited from more equitable land distribution, while urban centers swiftly reoriented production to serve Soviet interests. The south, with an estimated population of 15 million, remained predominantly rural, though it boasted strategically vital ports like Busan and Incheon. Here, the U.S. occupation confronted growing social unrest, marked by popular demonstrations and violent clashes with government forces. Many leftist groups faced repression, while other factions openly embraced anti-communist policies. In 1947, the United Nations tried to organize free elections across the peninsula, but the North boycotted the plan, deeming Western involvement illegitimate. The following year, 2 separate states were formally established. In the South, the Republic of Korea led by Syngman Rhee, an ardent anti-communist prepared to unify the peninsula by force. In the North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung. This split, fueled by the mounting hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, shaped the boundaries of a fracture bound to erupt into an even more devastating conflict. With the gradual withdrawal of U.S. and Soviet troops between 1948 and 1949, military presence in Korea dwindled to just a handful of advisors in each zone. Despite that, tensions ran high. Both the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea claimed to be the sole legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Along the 38th parallel, frequent clashes caused over 10,000 deaths, especially near Kaesong and Korwon. In the north, the army exceeded 130,000 troops, bolstered by around 150 T-34 tanks and plentiful Soviet-supplied light and heavy artillery. In the south, however, available soldiers numbered fewer than 100,000, mostly lightly armed and lacking any significant armored force. For Kim Il-sung, military superiority was pivotal. Aiming to reunify the peninsula by force, he sought support from Stalin and from China's newly established communist government. His close ties with Mao Zedong, cemented after the 1949 communist victory, secured a safe rear base for the north, along with training and supplies from beyond the Yalu River. Indeed, Mao's rise strengthened the Socialist Front in Asia, prompting the initially cautious Stalin to back the North Korean plan more openly. During that same period, global alignments were shifting swiftly. Europe was experiencing the Marshall Plan era and had just emerged from the 1948-49 Berlin blockade, while 1949 also saw the creation of NATO. In Asia, China's communist triumph placed the Korean peninsula in a far broader ideological contest, where Washington and Moscow tested their global clout. The South, militarily disadvantaged, relied on American support, though signals from Washington proved ambiguous. In January 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson delivered a speech excluding Korea from America's Pacific Defense Perimeter, the so-called Acheson Line. Kim Il-sung read that omission as a green light to act, moving the peninsula ever closer to open conflict, intensifying the likelihood of an armed confrontation in a region where rival ideologies threatened to clash at any moment ahead. In the spring of 1950, following protracted talks with Kim Il-sung, Stalin approved a plan to invade South Korea, provided Mao Zedong was ready to step in if required. Although he did not immediately commit regular troops, Mao promised political and logistical assistance, reserving direct intervention for when circumstances demanded. Encouraged by this socialist backing, the North amassed more than 135,000 soldiers near the 38th parallel, alongside over 150 T-34 tanks and hundreds of Soviet-made artillery pieces. In the South, fewer than 100,000 troops were available, mostly lightly armed and lacking armor. South Korean intelligence had noted suspicious troop movements close to the boundary, yet neither the scale nor timing of the offensive was fully grasped. At dawn on June 25, 1950, around 4 a.m., the North Korean army unleashed a multi-pronged assault, catching an unprepared southern defense off guard. Seoul fell within 3 days, triggering a vast civilian exodus and widespread panic behind the lines. At that moment, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council over China's seat, thus unable to veto U.S. proposals. Capitalizing on this, the United States secured a resolution authorizing military involvement in Korea. A UN-backed coalition formed, with 16 member nations, including the US, UK, Australia, Canada, Turkey, and more, deploying troops on the ground. The North Korean invasion ignited the first major armed crisis of the Cold War. Washington responded decisively, sending large forces and materiel, convinced Seoul's fall was just the opening act of a conflict poised to reshape East Asia's balance of power. Western alliances, tested in Korea, would remain pivotal for years to come, laying the groundwork for a shifting global order defined by intensifying ideological rivalry. The peninsula's fate now hung in the balance, as opposing blocs squared off over strategic footholds and competing visions, launching a war that would ravage cities, divide families, and ultimately leave a legacy of bitterness and division still felt on the Korean peninsula to this day, with no resolution in sight. Within weeks, the North seemed poised to triumph, yet events took an unexpected turn when U.S. forces counteract and UN troops arrived. The war, locked in an armistice, has never truly ended, leaving the Korean peninsula divided to this day. When dawn broke on Sunday, June 25, 1950, the roar of tank treads and gunfire shattered the stillness along the 38th parallel. Over 135,000 North Korean troops, backed by more than 150 Soviet T-34 tanks, poured towards Seoul, a mere 60 kilometers away. Confronted with such overwhelming force, the South Koreans, fewer than 100,000 ill-equipped men, saw their defenses collapse within hours. It was the start of a lightning war that would upend the entire Korean peninsula. Taken by surprise and lacking armor, the South Korean lines quickly gave way. In 48 hours, the front disintegrated as thousands of civilians fled south. Bridges over the Han River, which cuts through Seoul, became bottlenecks for a massive exodus. By June 28th, in just 3 days of fighting, the capital fell to the north. Scenes of panic and chaos marked the authorities' hurried evacuation. Many residents, unprepared, abandoned homes and possessions, hoping to find refuge further south. The swift fall of Seoul exposed the huge military gap between the two Koreas and shocked international opinion, which was only then grasping the conflict's grim seriousness. As Seoul fell to northern forces, the UN Security Council passed a resolution to protect South Korea. The Soviet Union's absence, caused by its boycott over the Chinese seat dispute, prevented any veto, enabling the United States to lead an international coalition. By July, the first American units arrived under General Douglas MacArthur, finding the South Korean army pushed into the country's southeastern tip. The Pusan perimeter, around the port of Pusan, now Busan, became the final bulwark against the North's advance. With fewer than 150 kilometers of front, this area defended the only hubs for UN supplies and reinforcement. Fighting was intense, and though outnumbered, the defenders fought on stubbornly. U.S. troops brought modern artillery and tanks, with air power offering critical cover. Despite heavy casualties and mounting pressure, the stand at the Pusan perimeter held firm, allowing new international contingents to arrive and paving the way for a determined counteroffensive. While the Pusan perimeter held off the North Korean onslaught, General Douglas MacArthur proposed an amphibious maneuver called Operation Chromite. The aim was to land at Incheon, on the peninsula's west coast, exploiting erratic tides and natural obstacles to catch enemy forces off guard. Many American strategists deemed it a risky plan. Incheon featured steep cliffs, treacherous seabeds, and dramatic tidal swings, any of which could turn the assault into a disaster. Yet MacArthur trusted the North Koreans would assume an amphibious landing there was impossible. At dawn on September 15, 1950, the landing began. Over 260 U.S. and Allied ships, including British, Australian, and Canadian vessels, carried more than 70,000 men onto Incheon's beaches. At the forefront, the 1st Marine Division, with 22,000 troops, and the U.S. 7th Infantry Division, with 25,000 soldiers, formed the core amphibious force, backed by South Korean units. Allied naval guns pounded artillery positions, while Australian and South African air units, flying over 150 aircraft, carried out strategic raids to suppress North Korean anti-aircraft defenses. The defenders, focused on the Pusan line, never expected an invasion from the west and were caught completely off guard. Within hours, the beachhead was secured, allowing additional Allied forces to land, including Turkish, French, Belgian, and Greek detachments tasked with fortifying supply routes in the rear. Meanwhile, from the south, South Korean and U.S. troops launched a pincer move, trapping numerous retreating North Korean units. Thanks to surprise, overwhelming firepower, and multinational coordination, Seoul was retaken in just 3 days, September 28th. The operation had a resounding media and morale impact, demonstrating the UN's determination and strategic edge, reversing the tide of a conflict that only weeks earlier had seemed lost to the South. This success significantly improved Korea's prospects under UN support. After retaking Seoul, the UN command decided to push north of the 38th parallel to unify the peninsula under South Korean rule. In early October, the UN and the Republic of Korea, ROK, Army, deployed forces along several axes towards the Chinese border. The western route led from Seoul through Kaesong and Pyongyang via the Gyeongchul Railway and the Taedong River Valley. In the central sector, U.S. and Allied units crossed the Chorwon Highlands, while in the east, reinforced South Korean troops moved on Wonsan and Hamhung. With air supremacy provided by roughly 1,000 American, British, and Australian aircraft, interdiction raids destroyed bridges and rail lines, hampering the withdrawal of some 80,000 remaining North Korean troops. In rear areas, Turkish, Canadian, and French infantry units secured newly liberated zones, while Eastern Front South Korean forces, now at 120,000 strong, aimed for the Tumen River to cut off any escape northward. On October 19th, with the entry into Pyongyang, UN forces captured thousands of enemy soldiers, over 10,000 prisoners in the first 3 days alone. Many in Washington and Seoul believed the war could end by Christmas, given Kim Il-sung's massive setbacks. Diplomatically, however, China grew alarmed at Western troops nearing its border and prepared a major intervention. In secret talks with Stalin, Mao Zedong resolved to send hundreds of thousands of volunteers to support the North, judging a pro-Western regime on Manchuria's doorstep unacceptable. The euphoria of Pyongyang's fall masked a stark truth. The war was about to enter a more unpredictable and bloody phase. As UN forces pressed forward beyond the 38th parallel from late October into November 1950, a new foe appeared. On October 25th, UN patrols encountered Chinese troops along the Yalu River, which marks the boundary between North Korea and Manchuria. They were the Chinese People's Volunteers, sent by Mao Zedong to prevent any pro-Western regime from forming on China's doorstep. The influx of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, over 300,000 by some estimates, aimed to shift the war's balance in the North's favor. Its impact was devastating both psychologically and operationally. Already worn down by weeks of advancing through mountainous terrain with poor infrastructure, UN forces now faced a numerically superior foe skilled in nighttime infiltration. Many outposts along strategic valleys and passes, such as the Yalu Corridor or the Incheon Highlands, crumbled under waves of Chinese infantry driven by fierce ideological resolve and aided by weak UN intelligence. The sudden appearance of Chinese columns on ridgetops, often cloaked in mist and dense forests, made their assaults all the more lethal. Logistically, US, South Korean, and other Allied forces had to supply thousands of troops and vehicles along ever longer, vulnerable routes. Roads were mostly unpaved, bridges lay in ruins, and below-zero temperatures hindered every move. Northern sectors like the Chungcheong River Valley or the Qinghai and Manpo areas demanded escorted convoys and constant repairs per kilometer. With China's entry, the war turned multinational, paving the way for one of its harshest, bloodiest phases. Combat now spanned national borders, intensifying an already brutal conflict whose outcome would echo far beyond the peninsula. The Chinese intervention caught the Allies off balance, reshaping strategic possibilities. The massive Chinese offensive unleashed in November overwhelmed UN lines near the Chungcheong River, forcing a rapid pullback. At the Chosin River, Chongjin, the U.S. 1st Marine Division and Allied units found themselves outnumbered by over 120,000 Chinese troops. Frigid temperatures, often below minus 30 degrees Celsius, made every movement a desperate ordeal. Here unfolded one of the Korean War's most legendary clashes. Though they suffered thousands of casualties, some estimates cite over 4,000 dead from wounds, combat, or frostbite. 30,000 U.S. Marines managed to break through the encirclement. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the American forces in the area, refused to call it a retreat, describing the maneuver instead as an advance in another direction. Despite their courage and resilience, the price in human lives was enormous. The 1st Marine Division alone recorded more than 10,000 dead, wounded, or frostbitten. Strategically, UN lines took a crushing blow. The entire northern front collapsed, pushing Allied commanders to orchestrate a general withdrawal to avoid total disaster amid the harsh Korean winter. Early 1951 brought yet another dramatic shift. On January 4th, combined Chinese and North Korean forces launched a broad offensive, reclaiming Seoul for the second time since the war began. Command and civilian evacuations occurred in great haste, leaving behind confusion and dismay. Meanwhile, General Walton Walker's December 1950 death led to General Matthew Ridgway taking charge. He reorganized UN forces and strengthened defensive lines along the Han River. In the ensuing months, with fresh international reinforcements and more coordinated operations, the UN mounted a gradual counterattack. By February, Allied lines solidified south of Seoul, slowing the Chinese advance. U.S. artillery and armor shipments, Turkish infantry units and other national contingents on the ground helped reduce enemy pressure. By March, the Allies' renewed offensive succeeded in retaking Seoul, reversing the conflict's momentum once again. Yet the front soon settled around the 38th parallel, creating a military stalemate. Repeated attempts at breakthrough by both sides failed, dragging the combat into a war of attrition. This deadlock foreshadowed the protracted negotiations that would dominate the remainder of the war, as neither camp could achieve a decisive victory. In the end, Korea became locked in a precarious balance, marking a pivotal stage of the Cold War. In under a year, the Korean peninsula witnessed frontline reversals, international interventions, and epic battles that redefined the Cold War's trajectory. Yet the story doesn't end here. Tensions kept mounting, culminating in decisions and clashes that would draw in military and political leaders alike, forever altering the peninsula's future. In the spring of 1951, General Douglas MacArthur pressed for a nuclear strike against Manchuria. What if President Harry Truman had yielded to this extreme demand? Instead, Truman chose to contain the conflict and fire MacArthur, removing him from command and making a decisive turning point in the Korean War. Thus, the war averted the specter of large-scale atomic devastation and followed the course we know today. But at what cost? And under what sacrifices? Replacing MacArthur was General Matthew Ridgway, entrusted with a more cautious yet equally resolute strategy. Meanwhile, the front began stabilizing around the 38th parallel, heralding the end of mobile warfare. UN forces and Sino North Korean units now faced each other in static positions, marked by trenches, fortifications, and long coils of barbed wire. This fresh phase, often likened to World War I trench combat, proved extremely grueling. The battlefield equilibrium, along with a political desire to avoid nuclear escalation, confirmed that MacArthur's total offensive belonged to the past. The Korean War entered a costly stalemate in both resources and human lives, revealing neither side would dare spark another cataclysm. By mid-1951, it was evident this conflict would stay contained, yet protracted. In July 1951, as UN and Sino North Korean armies faced off along a 240-kilometer front near the 38th parallel, representatives of the United States, China, and North Korea convened in Panmunjom, a village around 8 kilometers from Kaesong, to seek an armistice. On the ground, tens of thousands of soldiers fought in entrenched lines, even as negotiators strove to end a conflict that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded. The talks quickly revealed major sticking points. First came the precise boundary line to define the demarcation zone. Second, the fate of more than 100,000 prisoners of war, many of whom rejected forced repatriation. China and North Korea demanded the return of every POW, whereas the United States and its allies preferred voluntary repatriation. Additionally, no side wished to appear weak to domestic audiences, inflaming the already tense atmosphere at the table. Despite these negotiations, combat persisted. Casualties mounted daily along ridges and outposts, some just 30 or 40 kilometers from Panmunjom itself. The stark contrast between the battlefield's brutality and the formality of diplomatic talks slowed any progress, ensuring the path to an armistice would be long and fraught. The positional warfare, coupled with the difficulties of these discussions, would shape the following 2 years of conflict, leaving both sides locked in a costly deadlock that tested their endurance and resolve on every hill and trench across the landscape, underscoring how complex peace could ultimately be. Throughout a roughly 240-kilometer front, at least 100 hills changed hands multiple times amid extended clashes. Over 40 large-scale operations repeatedly altered tactical maps. On one side, UN forces, led by the United States and comprising various allies. On the other, determined Sino-North Korean troops resolved to hold firm. Seizing a ridge conferred control over the surrounding valleys, vital for supply routes and strategic maneuvers. Yet every new assault ran into trenches, fortified positions, and both sides' steadfast refusal to yield ground. Among the most notorious battles were Bloody Ridge, August to September 1951, and Heartbreak Ridge, September to October 1951, both on the eastern sector. At Bloody Ridge, fighting centered on hills 983 and 924, strategic for artillery firing and observation. Its estimated UN forces, mainly American and South Korean, suffered over 2,700 losses, while Sino-North Korean casualties surpassed 15,000 killed or wounded. A few weeks later, Heartbreak Ridge focused on hills 931 and 851, with American losses near 3,700 versus over 25,000 among defenders. Conditions were dire. Monsoon rains turned slopes to mud. Mountainous terrain encouraged subterranean bunkers and tunnels, while UN forces resorted to heavy aerial bombardment, often with napalm, to flush out defenders. Despite air superiority, Sino-North Korean infantry, driven by Mao Zedong's and Kim Il-sung's political resolve, kept counterattacking and inflicted severe losses. In this setting, capturing or losing a hill might yield only a few hundred meters, yet cost thousands of lives. While preliminary armistice talks began at Panmunjom, positional warfare persisted, with unrelenting back-and-forth advances and withdrawals defining the conflict until 1953. This grueling war of attrition exposed the immense human cost exacted by each engagement. Neither side would cede a critical vantage point without a fierce fight, guaranteeing that a line measuring just a few kilometers wide would become a nightmarish arena of mud, mortar barrages, and hand-to-hand combat. By late 1951, both armies understood the front might not shift significantly, yet high command demanded ongoing pressure, turning every position into a bloody prize. In 1952, the Truman administration intensified its bombing strategy against the northern areas of the Korean Peninsula. The goal was to erode North Korea and China's productive capacities by destroying key infrastructure like bridges, dams, power plants, and industrial sites. Over 1,000 UN aircraft, mostly American, conducted large-scale incursions, causing severe damage and swelling the number of internal refugees. Cities and villages struck by raids saw essential services collapse, forcing civilians to flee to safer areas or seek makeshift shelter. This air campaign aimed to pressure Pyongyang and Beijing into accepting more favorable armistice terms. Meanwhile, the United States approached a presidential election. In November 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a World War II hero, won the race, ushering in fresh perspectives. During his campaign, Eisenhower vowed to resolve the forgotten war in Korea, yet did not rule out tough measures if negotiations failed. This change at the White House also affected senior UN command. New diplomatic pressure was applied on Beijing, where fears of a potential nuclear clash were mounting. American and global public opinion, weary of a protracted and costly conflict, increasingly backed a settlement. Yet Truman's resolve to use air power as diplomatic leverage remained firm until his term's end. In 1952, this so-called hammer-from-above strategy peaked. That year alone, the U.S. Air Force launched tens of thousands of missions, dropping tons of bombs on key northern facilities. Over the entire war, it would conduct nearly 800,000 sorties, delivering around 635,000 tons of ordnance, including over 32,000 tons of napalm, a quantity surpassing that used in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. This relentless bombing campaign sought to cripple North Korea's infrastructure and political will, inching closer to negotiations, but also exacting a deep humanitarian toll. Civilian centers lay in ruins, fueling bitter resentment among survivors and shaping post-war animosities profoundly. By early 1953, the War of Position had reached its peak. While Panmunjom negotiations continued in fits and starts, the front remained a chain of trenches and fortifications. The harsh 1952-53 winter made combat even more grueling, as thousands of soldiers fought in brutal sub-zero conditions. Despite intensified UN air raids and Sino-North Korean infantry offensives, the 38th parallel still marked the main dividing line with minimal territorial shifts. Amid this grinding stalemate came the Battle of Pork Chop Hill, March to July 1953, emblematic of ferocious struggles over seemingly minor ridges that held immense symbolic value. Located north of Seoul, Pork Chop Hill became a focal point between American troops and Chinese forces. Every meter extracted precious lives. Estimates suggest the United States lost over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Chinese casualties ran even higher, likely several thousand. Heavy artillery, bombing runs, and massive infantry waves underscored the brutality of a conflict that now gained virtually no ground at utterly prohibitive cost. Meanwhile, conditions for an armistice gradually matured. The United States, under President Eisenhower, increased diplomatic pressure on China, threatening further military escalation or even nuclear action should talks fail. Also central were the fates of prisoners of war, particularly those refusing to return to communist-held areas, and the precise demarcation along the 38th parallel. These issues dominated the arduous discussions. Ultimately, on July 27, 1953, the Panmunjom Armistice was signed, establishing a demilitarized zone about 4 kilometers wide near the 38th parallel. Yet no formal peace treaty ever materialized, leaving the two Koreas technically at war. This agreement halted the fighting, but never resolved the underlying divisions, ushering in an armed peace destined to endure for decades. Despite the carnage, the uneasy truce allowed both sides to regroup, signaling a painful legacy that shaped the peninsula's future. Millions had suffered 3 years of near-constant fighting, only to see borders hardly shift. In hindsight, the armistice was less a definitive solution than a tense pause that would cast its shadow over North Asia's geopolitics for generations, leaving both Koreas locked in unresolved rivalry. With the armistice signing in July 1953, the Korean peninsula remained split into two diametrically opposed political entities, linked only by the painful memory of 3 years of war. In the south, the Republic of Korea, initially authoritarian and backed by the United States, experienced an economic boom from the 1960s onward, gradually democratizing until the 1980s, when civilian governments were elected and full political freedoms emerged. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea developed as a Stalinist-style regime under Kim Il-sung, marked by personality cult, heavy militarization, and later, a nuclear program. Millions of families remained divided, while relations between the two Koreas stayed hostile, lacking any definitive peace treaty. The war, never formally concluded, became a suspended conflict that has shaped regional politics for decades, drawing in global actors like the United States, China, and Russia. Even now, the Korean War continues influencing geopolitical balances, revealing how profoundly those 3 years impacted the peninsula and the wider world.
China's Great Wall was built to halt Mongol invaders. Hadrian's Wall contained northern tribes. The walls of Jerusalem, Constantinople, and every city in history stood to defend against enemies at the gate. Yet, in 1961, Berlin erected a wall unlike any other, the Berlin Wall. For the first time in history, a wall was not about keeping enemies out, but about locking its own people in. a prison that changed history. Why would a government barricade a city from within? What drove the USSR and East Germany to seal Berlin overnight, fully and irrevocably transforming it into an open-air prison? Why did that wall have to exist, and what was it truly defending? After the Berlin Airlift, tensions in Europe soared. Germany was carved up among the four victorious powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Even Berlin, though within the Soviet zone, was split into four sectors. In 1949, two German states emerged: the Federal Republic of Germany, supported by NATO and the Marshall Plan, and the German Democratic Republic, allied with the USSR. It was the start of the Cold War. Berlin became the conflict's symbol. In the West, a city reborn. In the East, a socialist regime. With the Iron Curtain drawn, rivalry between superpowers ignited across Europe. Meanwhile, the Cold War had ceased to be an ideological duel. In 1950, the Korean War erupted, the first true proxy conflict between East and West. On one side stood the Communist North, backed by the USSR and China, which dispatched nearly 1 million volunteers. On the other, the South, supported by the United Nations and led by the United States, mobilizing over 1.7 million troops. 21 UN countries took part, turning the Korean Peninsula into a battleground and a symbol of each bloc's resolve. In Berlin, fear of another global war spread swiftly. Thousands of East German citizens began fleeing westward. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 500,000 people crossed Berlin to reach the Federal Republic of Germany. No walls, no impenetrable blockade. Crossing an administrative boundary, using fake documents, or simply boarding a train to West Berlin was enough. The socialist government lost workers, technicians, doctors, teachers, and especially ambitious youth. Official propaganda labeled them traitors, yet the flow did not slow. Soon, East German leaders would conclude that only far more drastic measures could halt it. This exodus revealed the GDR's vulnerability, undermining its credibility at home and abroad. In 1952, to stem the flow westward, the German Democratic Republic decided to seal its entire land border with the Federal Republic of Germany, over 800 miles from the Baltic coast near Lübeck down to the Hof area. Barbed wire, barriers, and armed watchtowers staffed by the Grenztruppen were erected. Anyone trying to cross through forests, fields, or rural stretches of Lower Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia risked landmines, patrols, and gunfire. Yet Berlin remained an exception. The boundary between East and West was still formal, with few checkpoints, open roads, and an easily traversable frontier. Precisely that anomaly turned Berlin into the leading escape route for Eastern citizens. While the rest of the Iron Curtain became ever more impregnable, the city's urban border stayed porous. Each day, thousands freely crossed both sectors. From the regime's viewpoint, Berlin was becoming a dangerous gateway to freedom, one that needed to be shut as soon as possible. Its open streets stood out as a loophole amid an otherwise fortified frontier, prompting urgent action. In May 1955, the Soviet Union founded the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance that included East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. This bloc directly challenged Western NATO, formalizing Europe's military split into two armed spheres set for confrontation. The GDR's entry bolstered the Soviet presence in the region and reinforced Moscow's sway over East Germany's armed forces and internal policy. In October 1956, Hungary rose up against its communist regime, seeking liberation from Soviet authority. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the revolt by force. Over 2,500 people were killed, and thousands of Hungarians fled westward. That massacre revealed to the entire Eastern Bloc how far the USSR would go to defend its system, no matter the cost. In East Berlin, the GDR leadership vividly recalled the June 17, 1953 uprising. Thousands of workers had protested rising production quotas and the regime's harsh conditions. The protests began at Stalin-Ollie work sites, but spread citywide within hours. Not only workers, but ordinary citizens, wary of restrictions and propaganda, took to the streets. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. Tanks rolled in, dozens were killed, and thousands arrested. That crackdown left a deep scar, proving to East Berliners that dissent carried a dire price. Fear now loomed across East Berlin, where memories of violent suppression stifled dissent, underscoring the extent of Soviet resolve to maintain control in the GDR, whatever the consequences. In October 1957, a technological breakthrough shook the West. The USSR launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, igniting what Americans would dub the Sputnik shock. Suddenly, Moscow's ability to send an object into orbit signaled the capacity to build long-range missiles capable of striking anywhere in the Western Bloc. It was a jarring psychological blow, demonstrating a Soviet technological edge amid the Cold War. In 1958, buoyed by this momentary advantage, Nikita Khrushchev raised the stakes with an ultimatum. He demanded that the United States, France, and the United Kingdom withdraw from West Berlin, calling it a foreign body in socialist territory. Yet the West stood firm. To yield would have meant abandoning its defensive role at Europe's core. Military and diplomatic presence in West Berlin remained steadfast, and tensions soared, making the city one of the Cold War's most incendiary flashpoints. This standoff underscored the high stakes involved, with Berlin emerging yet again as the epicenter of a global confrontation. As the USSR kept expanding its reach, a new factor pushed tensions sky high. In 1959, Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba, bringing communism just a few miles from US shores. Soon after, in 1960, the Soviets managed to shoot down an American U-2 spy plane near Sverdlovsk in the Urals, thus revealing the United States had been running high-altitude surveillance missions inside the communist bloc. Capturing the pilot dealt a blow to Western credibility, further fueling mistrust between the two superpowers. Meanwhile, in East Berlin, the exodus showed no sign of abating. In 1960 alone, over 200,000 people crossed the city's border into West Berlin, among them doctors, engineers, teachers, and other skilled workers. This mass departure undercut East Germany's economy and exposed its ideological frailty, while propaganda tried to hide the issue or brand defectors as traitors. This surge laid bare the emptiness behind socialist promises, prompting East German authorities to tighten border measures while publicly downplaying the crisis, and no official explanation sufficed. Complicating matters, Berlin felt almost surreal. Though technically in Eastern territory, West Berlin still maintained ties with the West, and even some transport routes that ran beneath areas under Eastern control. Rumor had it that, in those months, certain residents used ghost trains or seldom guarded paths to dodge checkpoints and reunite with family and friends. This showed how difficult it was for the regime to seal the flow entirely, which would grow until the problem became completely unmanageable. In April 1961, the United States backed an attempted landing by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs in a desperate effort to topple Fidel Castro and end the newly established communist government in Cuba. The operation collapsed disastrously, triggering a sharp escalation in tensions between Washington and Moscow. In June of that year, US President John F. Kennedy met Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. Their face-to-face was laden with mistrust and yielded no compromise. Kennedy reiterated that the United States would never abandon Berlin, seen as a bastion of freedom in a Europe fractured by the Cold War. Meanwhile, NATO increased its contingents in West Germany. During those years, Kennedy strengthened America's bond with West Berlin's population, culminating in his famous June 1963 visit when he proclaimed the iconic phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner, to underscore the West's solidarity with the divided city. Yet, by 1961, the GDR leadership, under the USSR's hardline guidance, was planning a drastic solution to stem the outflow of fleeing citizens, the total closure of West Berlin. which would become one of the most dramatic chapters in Germany's history, the Berlin Wall. On the night of August 12 through 13, 1961, everything changed forever. GDR soldiers, police, and workers encircled West Berlin with barbed wire, blocking roads and rail lines. In under 48 hours, the city was abruptly sealed off, with dozens of miles of barriers slicing through neighborhoods and families. The evening before, many Berliners had gone to sleep oblivious. By morning, phones and transport links were cut. Entire districts literally split in two. The psychological impact was enormous. In a single day, a once unified city became two separate worlds. Those temporary fences soon gave way to a concrete wall that, upon completion, stretched over 96 miles, studded with more than 300 guard towers and a death strip up to 100 meters wide in places, equipped with trenches, fences, and firing positions. In the following years, more than 5,000 people attempted to flee, yet at least 140 lost their lives in the desperate dash for freedom. It was the most tangible symbol of a global order built on division and fear. The Berlin Wall remained in place for 28 years, dividing not just the city, but the entire world between East and West. From the night of August 13, 1961, until its demise on November 9, 1989, it claimed at least 140 lives among those who tried scaling it. As the starkest symbol of the Cold War, it finally fell under the Berliners' own push on November 9, 1989. If you enjoyed this Cold War narrative, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with fellow history lovers. Thank you for watching.